It's a great pleasure to introduce Bill Foege. Here we are in the Foege Auditorium in the William H. Foege building, introducing Dr. Foege to talk. And when this building was launched in, I think it was March of 2006, Bill Foege was, of course, a speaker, and he said that the hardest thing any of you working in this building are going to have to master is learning how to pronounce the word Foege. And if you think about it, there are a lot of ways to mispronounce the name Foege. Bill graduated from Pacific Lutheran University and then got his MD degree at the University of Washington and went on to get his master's degree at Harvard. And then he launched a new career going to the Centers for Disease Control after his internship in which he, I think, did on Staten Island. This is a bad week for Staten Island, isn't it? He wound up working with the EIS, the Epidemiology Intelligence Service, for this, what was then called the Communicable Disease Center. Now it's called the Center for Disease Control. And he became director for the Smallpox Eradication program, eventually for CDC. But before that, his early experience in Africa with the EIS, which is described in this book he's going to be telling you about, is fascinating. And it included a period of time when he was assigned to a village for smallpox eradication, and they ran out of, well, they didn't have enough smallpox vaccine. They had to figure out how to use it in a very effective way and not do mass vaccination. So I hope you're going to tell them about how this led to what came to be the strategy that actually led to the eradication of smallpox. So he went on to become director of the smallpox eradication program for CDC, and he did that until 1973. And then he decided to leave that position and go to India to actually lead the efforts to try to control and eliminate smallpox in India, where the problem was still hanging on. And he and his colleagues in India succeeded. He then came back to the CDC, where he became the director of the CDC for several years. And then he's had so many positions, distinguished positions since then, that I won't try to list them all. Most recently, he's been a senior fellow at the Gates Foundation, so we've had a chance to see a lot of him here. And the most important thing is that he's been the chairman of the External Advisory Board for the Department of Global Health. So he's had many other honors, but that one is the one we appreciate most. He's actually had more than 60 awards of many types. But this year, in 2012, he received the U.S. Presidential Medal of Freedom, which is the nation's highest civilian honor. So his book is quite amazing. I don't know how many of you have had a chance to look at it yet, but I'm hoping many of you will after he tells us about it. It's wonderful. It's very inspiring. My favorite chapters are the one where he was in Nigeria, faced with that shortage of vaccine, and thought about how to control the problem he was dealing with. And then the final conclusion, where he summarizes a lot of the wisdom from his previous experience. So with that, it's a pleasure to welcome you here, Bill, to this group.
Thank you, King. It's very nice to be back here, and if someone's still looking for a space, you could take mine. One of my favorite people at CDC was a man by the name of Hod Ogden, and he was a wordsmith. He was always funny and interesting, and when he was on his deathbed, he was surrounded by his family and some of the people he worked with, and he asked Cappy Lord, one of the people working with him, if she would write his obituary. And she agreed to do that. Within an hour or so, he went into a coma, and we got a word around that he had hours to live. But the interesting thing is he woke up the next morning, and he was surprised, everybody was surprised, and he went on to live for a couple more years. And he talked about what it was like to come back and pick up on conversations that he had left. But he said nothing was as good as the chance to edit his obituary. And I say that because everyone in here has been editing their obituary every day, and you will continue to do that every day that you live. Some general thoughts before we look at smallpox. One of the things that's come out of the presidential campaign is an increase in employment, and particularly the employment of fact checkers. And when I think about those of you who are going into health professions, some of the things that will be expected of you in the future, one of them will be to be fact checkers. People will want to know, does this vaccine actually protect? Does it have side effects? What should I be taking on my trip in order to prevent malaria? So fact checkers will be one of the things that you all have to do. Another thing, increasingly, people will expect you to be both a generalist and a specialist. A generalist to understand as best you can how the world works, and then to bring some passion, some specialty, to figure out how to improve that world that isn't working the way it should. Your education, I can tell you right now, will be inadequate for whatever position you take in the future. Almost none of the things that I learned turn out to be useful at this point. But the skills are still useful of how to find facts, how to find information. And so you won't leave here actually ready for your first job. You'll find that you get your first job, but now you know how to find the truth and to figure out what it is you need for that first job. You will all be expected to be both artists and scientists. And this is something you remember C.P. Snow said he never expected to see the gap to be bridged between the humanities, the arts, and science. Science has simply increased since that day tremendously. And yet, it seems to me we bridge that gap every day in the medical professions. We're applying that science to change what happens in the life of a person. So you'll be expected to be artists and scientists. Will Durant tells us that the first scientist that we know by name, and possibly the first person we know by name, was Imhotep from Egypt. He was a physician and he was an artist. He drew up the plans for the step pyramid, and then he built the step pyramid. And Will Durant makes the point, isn't that a great thing to strive for, even if you're the last person in history, to be an artist and a scientist simultaneously? Someone asked the question about how do you get a life plan? And I say be very careful of a life plan. If I had been able to carry out my life plan, I would still be running a health center in Nigeria. What happened instead was, after 2 years, that's what I trained for. That's what I was ready to do. I spent 2 years there, and then suddenly there was a civil war. It was the Nigerian Civil War where Biafra separated, and for most of the people in this room, if you know that name Biafra at all, it's because you read something in history, but you don't know what it was like. Yesterday's New York Times has 2 book reviews, one of them from a Yoruba writer and one an Igbo writer. And the Igbo writer is writing about what it was like during the Nigerian Civil War to live in eastern Nigeria. And that's where I was living. So beware of a life plan, because if I had stayed there, if the war hadn't broken out and I had to come back, I would never have had a chance to work at CDC. I never would have had a chance to work at the Gates Foundation or at the Carter Center. I never would have had a chance to work on the Mectizan program. And so I think the thing to do is know what it is you want to do in your mind, which is to improve the health of the world, to reduce the disparities, the inequities, and then be open to lots of possibilities, because you simply can't know what will be presented to you. Smallpox. I was interested in the disease, but I never had any intention of actually working in smallpox. I was with the EIS program at CDC when I got a call to go to Farmington, New Mexico. There was a Navajo child with a disease that they thought might be smallpox. It turned out not to be, but CDC made a laboratory error, and for a day or two we thought it was smallpox. It was a very exciting time, I can tell you. And then later, when I was in India, I saw smallpox for the first time, and then later I go to Nigeria. Before we had smallpox vaccine, there was something called variolation, which was actually vaccinating with smallpox virus itself. And this is a publication from Lady Montagu, who was the wife of the British ambassador to Turkey. And she wrote back to England that they would take children out to a farm, maybe 20 or 30 at a time, and they would vaccinate all of them with smallpox virus, or variolate all of them, and they would keep them there until they had recovered from their mild smallpox, and then she said they would go home and they would be protected for the rest of their life. The British royal family was interested in this, and they tried this on prisoners. It seemed to work. And then, to their credit, they tried it on their own children. So the British royal family was the second group. And this caught on in England. And I'll make this very fast, but it caught on so much in England that by the time we had the Battle of Quebec in December 31st, 1775, is that right? The America, go ahead, challenge me. So the American troops invaded at midnight. They invaded Quebec, and they had so much smallpox in the American troops that they didn't succeed. The British won that battle, and now the British were left with a bunch of sick people. The British did not get smallpox because their troops had all been variolated. And it may be the reason why Canada stayed with the UK and did not become part of the United States. It so impressed George Washington that he decided to variolate US troops, and he kept it top secret so that the British could not invade at the time that our troops were down with light smallpox. But he succeeded in doing it, and then there was some equity between the immunity levels of American troops and British troops. And so I think it may have been the most important tactical decision in the entire Revolutionary War to variolate the troops. So Lady Montagu is the one that introduced this to the UK. About the same time, in Boston, there was an outbreak, I think 1718, and it was clear in the outbreak that, according to Cotton Mather, Cotton Mather was a theologian, but he was also a very good scientist, and he noticed that the rates of smallpox were lower in African Americans than in whites, and he learned that African Americans had brought the idea of variolation from Africa to the US. He then tried to popularize it in the United States, and possibly just because of who he was, no one wanted to buy on, which is why we went into that battle not having been variolated. But so this is the work on variolation. Edward Jenner is the first one that we credit with giving a smallpox vaccination. And this is the home he was living in 1796. He was a practitioner in Berkeley, England. And in his home, it's a museum today, they've left his study the way it was. He was sitting at this desk. He had just returned from declaring the coroner dead and was writing out the death certificate when he had a stroke. They carried him up one flight of stairs, put him on a bed. He lived for 3 or 4 days. And they've kept this room the way it was. They've kept this table the way, and this looks almost like a painting, that it's so beautiful. in his home, they have a picture of the cow that provided the cowpox to the milkmaid, who then gave the cowpox material to a boy, James Phipps, all of this with the help of Edward Jenner. And the cow is Blossom. So they have a picture of Blossom that started this entire process. I took this picture, and they had been telling me how the house was haunted. And they even showed a picture where they thought there's a ghost in the background. I took this picture, and right away I said, this is not a very good picture because of the glare. So I took another picture within a minute. And you see, so I think that's actually Sarah Nelms, the milkmaid. And this is a hut behind his home, and for one day a week he would give free vaccinations to the poor children of the area. This is his publication on that. He did the work, first vaccination in 1796. He published this in 1798. This was turned down by a peer-reviewed journal on the basis that his N was 1. And so he had to self-publish it. But it's one of the most important publications in history of public health. Sometimes people think that Edward Jenner was just lucky. He actually observed milkmaids for 12 years before he did that first vaccination. He had read poets talking about the nice complexion of milkmaids, and he was asking the question why. But then he heard a milkmaid say, of course I'm protected against smallpox. I've had cowpox. And so other people knew more than the scientists about what was going on, and then he observed for 12 years before he did that first vaccination. Then it took him 2 years before he published it because a royal family called on him to do things. King was talking about Nigeria. December 4th, 1966, I was called by radio by a missionary who said, I think we have an outbreak of smallpox in a remote area. And we got motorbikes and we went to that area in the afternoon. This is the first patient I saw, and indeed it is smallpox. But this is a disease that you can just feel how much that hurts. This man does not want to move because when he moves anything, it starts bleeding. And so he just tries not to move. This was 2 weeks before the smallpox eradication program was officially supposed to start, which is why we didn't have vaccine. And so we sat around that night asking the question, if we were a smallpox virus bent on immortality, what would we do next? And the obvious answer is you find a person susceptible, because that virus only lives for a few weeks in the body and then has to find another person or the chain stops. It's a very precarious existence. So we then asked the question, could we figure out where the virus was and just vaccinate the people around the virus? Number two, could we figure out where people might move next? And it's, of course, wherever they have relatives or where the markets are. And so we used our small amount of vaccine on, well, that night we got on the radio with missionaries. We divided the geographic area up. Each missionary then sent runners to every village in their area. 24 hours later, we knew exactly where smallpox was. We knew which villages. So we used most of our vaccine on those villages and the remainder of the vaccine in 3 areas where we thought the disease might spread. In 2 of those 3 areas, we already had people in the incubation period but didn't know it. But by the time they got their symptoms, everyone around them had been vaccinated. So they were protected, and the outbreak stopped very fast. That's what led us to ask whether we could do this in larger areas of Nigeria. We tried it first in 12 million people, and then we tried it in country after country. But now I'm going to skip ahead, because the big challenge with this approach was India. India had far more smallpox than Africa. And so in October of 1973, we tried the same approach in India. We had worked now for 3 months before this graph starts in January of 1974. 3 months trying to figure out how to find cases of smallpox and how to contain them. We started out with a very simple thing, going village by village and asking head people there if they had seen cases of smallpox. There are a lot of reasons why people won't tell you the truth on something like that. But if you go to schools and show a picture of a child with smallpox to school children, they vie with each other to be able to give the information. And so school children turned out to be good sources of information. And we began finding smallpox every place. In 6 days' time, we found 10,000 new cases of smallpox that no one knew existed. And so we started working on approaches. By January of 1974, that first blue bar shows that we found 600 new outbreaks in the state of Bihar. By the next month, we found over 2,000. By the next month, almost 4,000 new. These are new outbreaks. And an outbreak could be anywhere from a case to 100 cases, but they averaged about 10 or 12 cases. And so we were finding more and more cases. About this time, we were having in Bihar about 1,500 new cases a day, about a new case every minute. The red bar shows our ability to contain those outbreaks. And by March, you can see we're not even containing the outbreaks found that month, and we're just falling farther and farther behind. It's a very discouraging period. By April, we're up to almost 5,000 new outbreaks, plus all the ones that we still had from previous months. But we're gaining on the number of outbreaks contained. And finally, by May, the number of new outbreaks starts down for the first time. Our containment continues to improve, and then month after month, we just simply improve. And here, before PowerPoint, is the graph I made and sent around to all of the workers to show that we'd had a crossover between number of outbreaks contained and number of new outbreaks found. Now, if I can turn this back off and the lights on. So, what you saw in Bihar was so fast that India went, thank you very much, from highest cases of smallpox in decades to 0 in 12 months' time. I mean, it's one of the most dramatic things that I have seen in public health. So I mentioned one thing after another then came after smallpox. There were people who said, smallpox eradication is the high point in my life and everything is downhill from here. And that isn't true at all. It just keeps getting better. I'm only going to tell you about one other story, and that is the Mectizan distribution program. And I tell you this because 2 weeks ago we had a celebration, 25 years of Mectizan distribution. Mectizan is given for a disease called river blindness. People get the disease when a fly, it's called Simulium damnosum, and what a great name for a black fly that actually deposits larval forms of Onchocerca. These larval forms form under the skin into a ball. A female develops and puts out microfilaria just continuously for about 12 to 15 years. These microfilaria course through the body, and eventually they cause blindness. So in some villages with a lot of Onchocercas, you have blindness in many, many people by the age of 45 or 50. And it becomes common, it became common, to see young boys leading a blind person around with a stick. And there are now 4 statues around the world of such a young boy leading a blind person. One is at the Carter Center in Atlanta, one is at the WHO headquarters in Geneva, one is in the lobby of the World Bank, which often says they're not a health organization, and this is in the lobby. But the first one put was in the lobby of Merck Drug Company. And so the first thing people see when they walk into the lobby at Merck is a sculpture for a drug where they're not making any money. I mean, it's a remarkable thing that they were willing to do this. So the disease is a devastating disease, but in the early 80s, Merck developed a drug from a soil sample taken from a golf course in Japan, in a lab in the United States, and developed a drug called HeartGuard to protect dogs against heartworm. And if you live in an area of the United States, which is most areas of the United States where they have heartworm, you give that drug once a month to your dog. When you buy it, there's a red heart. You put that on the right day of the calendar, and that's when you give HeartGuard. Then the question came up, could this be useful for a human disease? And so Roy Vagelos, who was head of research at the time, was provided money for people to go to Africa to see if this would protect humans. It was better in humans than in dogs. In dogs, you have to give it once a month. In humans, once a year. And it protects humans from blindness due to onchocerciasis. Merck decided to give the drug away free. They attempted to give it to WHO, and they backed off because the bureaucracy became so great. They attempted to give it to USAID, and USAID said they weren't interested. They came to Atlanta, and they asked me the same questions they'd asked WHO. If we give it free, will you figure out how to distribute it? I had three things that worried me. Number one, how long will you give it free? So they got on a conference call and came back, and they said, we don't know what else this drug might be good for, so we have to be a little careful. But for onchocerciasis, we will give it free as long as needed. I mean, you just can't believe what a statement like that means from a pharmaceutical company. Number two, I worried about what are the side effects once you get up to 10,000 and then 100,000 and then 1 million people. And if you have a death in 100,000 people, that's 10 deaths per million, and this is going to be a big problem. Make a long story short, it turns out to be one of the safest drugs you can imagine. It's absolutely a safe drug. Number three, how do you get people to take it if they won't see the beneficial effects for 20 years? That is, they don't get blindness. Well, it turns out I was so dumb. I actually lived in a village in Africa, and I would sit around with people at night, and they would be scratching all the time. I was so dumb, I didn't realize they were scratching because of onchocerciasis, and that it caused intense itching. And in some people, it was the first thing they knew in the morning, the last thing at night. They simply could never find relief. One pill, not all of them, but one pill, and many of them had the first itch-free day that they could ever remember. And if that isn't a great marketing tool. It turns out that it also was 100% effective in treating roundworms. And people know when they pass roundworms. So marketing turned out to be no problem at all. We set an objective of reaching 6 million people in 6 years, and we did it in 4 years. And then it just kept increasing. And I actually went to Africa for the 250 millionth treatment. 2 weeks ago, we had a celebration at the Carter Center, 25 years of this program. They've now distributed 1 billion treatments free. I mean, this is just unbelievable. And our approach to pharmaceutical companies is to always be negative, to always suspect them of trying to do something to get our money. And we don't realize when they do something good. Why do they do something good? Because there's value in it for them. What is the value? It's not just that they save money on income tax or that they get good publicity. They didn't realize when they started that the greatest return on that investment would be having employees with loyalty because they like working for a company that does this. I mean, it became so clear. So at the Carter Center, I told the story of how President Carter went to Washington, D.C. to get an award on a Thursday night. It was the same time we were having a Mectizan committee meeting in France. I was chairing that meeting, and late on Thursday, a man by the name of Eric Autism from WHO got up and he reported on a study where someone gave 2 drugs, Mectizan and albendazole, to people with elephantiasis or lymphatic filariasis. And they found benefit from it. Now, either drug alone gives no benefit, and so it still eludes me. Why would anyone take 2 drugs that don't work and put them together? But anyway, they did, and it worked. Then the question was, who makes this drug? And the answer was SmithKline Beecham. Does anyone know someone in the company high enough up that they could give us the drug free, that we could start a new program on lymphatic filariasis? And the answer was no. But we went to dinner that night, and we kept talking about the possibilities. Everyone was excited. Next morning, Friday morning, 10 o'clock, I'm chairing the meeting again, and someone puts a note in front of me. President Carter is on the phone. Would you take the call? I was being paid by the Carter Center at the time. So you know what I did. I took the call, and President Carter said, it's 5 o'clock in the morning in Atlanta. But he said, I'm so excited, I have to talk. He asked me, does the name Jan Leschly mean anything to you? And I said, no, it doesn't. He said, well, I had dinner with him last night in Washington, and he is the CEO of a company called SmithKline Beecham. And he told me how excited he was by what Merck had done with Mectizan and what this meant for employee loyalty. And he asked Carter, do you have any ideas on what we could do that would be similar? I mean, talk about serendipity. By the end of the day, Carter had called him back. We had a commitment for albendazole, and that was the beginning of the global lymphatic filariasis program. Okay. Your vocation, you all have visions of what you're going to be doing in the future. And I don't want to destroy any of those visions. But I want to indicate some things that you may not know you're going to be doing. One thing is, the world will expect you to be a fortune teller. They will expect you to predict the future on everything. None of us can see the future, but I can tell you, those of you working in epidemiology have a window to the future that most people don't have, and use that window well. Number two, they will expect you to be a ventriloquist. That is, you will be giving ideas to someone else. You will be giving ideas to your dean, or to your supervisor, or to someone in politics. It was Gerald Ford who announced we would have a swine flu program in this country. So you're giving the information to someone that may have more influence than you do. Many people resent this, but I'm telling you, it's one of the most powerful things you can do, because you now have a chance to educate that person who is going to be putting out the word. That person thinks you're serving him or her. In truth, they're serving you, because they're allowing you to get the truth out to other people. In the book, I have a section, and I'll read just a little bit of it, where a commissioner of health in Bihar State is now talking to the troops before they start the final phase of smallpox eradication. And what he says is, we are meeting today to launch the final phase of smallpox eradication in Bihar State. The world is now depending on our success in this venture, and I request your best efforts to see that we do not fail the world. Chief emphasis during the next 3 months will be placed on 2 activities. The first, to find all cases of smallpox. The second, to control each outbreak. I must caution you that the key ingredient of the campaign will not be words or money or vaccine, but will instead be the dedication with which each of you approaches this historical campaign. I look forward to the day when we all can enjoy a smallpox-free Bihar State. Now, what I don't say in the book is I wrote that speech. Being a ventriloquist, this guy had, I tell you, those smallpox workers would have walked through fire for him when he was done talking. I could never have done that. And so I was using him. And the night before, I happened to be in a cheap hotel that had just sprayed the kitchen, and the cockroaches were coming into my room in such volume that there was no way to keep them off of the desk or off of me. And here I was trying to write this talk, and the talk became so important to me, I finally ignored cockroaches and just let them roam. And in order to be able to get this speech to the minister first thing in the morning. So I was using him, and he didn't even know it. So don't resent being the ventriloquist for other people, bringing truth to someone else that can actually tell it for you. Now, you'll also be expected to be a master of deviation. We all use statistics and means and medians, but we also use standard deviations. And so you study these in class, and everyone pretends they know what it means, and a few people do. But you will be using standard deviations all your life to try to figure out what is the mix around the mean, and where are the disenfranchised. And so one of the things expected is that you will become a master of deviation. You will know how to use that tool in order to help the disenfranchised. You'll also be expected to be a propagandist. And I use this in the original meaning of the word, that it was to publicize as an essayist, as a speaker. And that's what you will be. Even when you are playing the ventriloquist, you are where you are because you are trusted. You can give amazing things to words and have someone else use them as a propagandist. Now, General Marshall didn't write the Marshall Plan. Marshall Plan was actually written by Will Clayton. General Marshall didn't first give the Marshall Plan. It was given by Dean Acheson, and it was given at the Delta State Teachers College in Cleveland, Mississippi. James Reston was a young reporter, and he actually reported on it, but it didn't go anyplace. It wasn't until General Marshall gave that same speech at the Harvard commencement that people picked up on it. And if you go back to that day, you find that that was not the first thing on the wire services from Boston. First thing was how much money had been given by the different classes at Harvard, how much they had donated. This was only the second thing on the wire service. So no one seems to have questioned when Churchill came to this country after the Second World War and gave his famous Iron Curtain speech. Where did he get that term? Well, he got that term because it was first used by a master propagandist in December of 1944 in a speech. And then in January 1945, that speech was actually published and ran in the London Times. And that speech was given by Joseph Goebbels, Hitler's head of propaganda. And so this was picked up by someone else and used in a different way. You will be expected to be a propagandist. And finally, you'll be expected to be a magician. In this state, you've seen the kind of problems we've had with pertussis outbreaks. Now, pertussis outbreaks come from a lot of different reasons. I can tell you that parents in the state of Washington are absolutely concerned with the health of their children, just like parents every place. And yet this particular outbreak is due to some parents not getting pertussis vaccine, probably some problems with the pertussis vaccine itself, some problems with appropriations and public health people available to give this, some problems with politicians very quickly jumping to conclusions and to criticize people. And much of it, though, due to not having the right information. Why not? Because these parents were trying to do the right thing, and they were believing a man by the name of Andrew Wakefield. Some of you know the story. Andrew Wakefield published an article in The Lancet, and he related autism to the use of measles, mumps, rubella vaccine. It took a long time and millions of dollars to be able to study this and find there is no connection between vaccines and autism. And then we learned that he was actually being paid by a lawyer who had a lawsuit against a vaccine company, that there were some improprieties involved in this. But it is so hard and almost impossible to reverse this conception people have now of vaccines causing autism. The best information we have is that autism is probably due to something that happens before birth, that most of the information is before birth, not after birth, and yet we live with this problem, and so you're expected to be a magician. Oh, one more thing, and this sounds almost illegal. If none of the rest of this sounded illegal, this will. You're expected to rewrite history. Now, we're all familiar with being involved in a program and some person in that program writing what happened in a way you say, well, that's not what had happened. They're rewriting history. You are expected to rewrite history before it happens. And so that's why we don't have polio and smallpox and other things, because there were people rewriting history before the fact. And that is going to be one of the important jobs that you have. And I can tell you that all of this gives you immortality. Will Durant says that his definition of immortality is the absorption of one's soul in deathless acts. And so you will be involved in deathless acts and your immortality is assured. Lillian Dixon has said that life is like a coin. We can spend it any way we want, but we can only spend it once. And so you are now heading into a profession where you get to spend the coin in a very good and useful way. Last point, what about compassion? Where does compassion fit in? Well, 10 years or so ago, when I needed a cancer surgeon, I found myself trying to figure out what's the best avenue here, and I found that I was looking for incredibly good skills, and I wanted a person with an ego so strong they hate to lose. I wasn't looking for compassion. And then later, when I got to know this person, I realized his skills were so good because he started with compassion. When I hired people in global health, I was looking for people who were problem solvers. And again, for people who just hated to lose. They wanted to solve every problem. And they liked the idea of they've never seen a problem they can't solve. That's what I was looking for. But later found out that many of them were involved in this because of compassion. I gave up trying to figure out how do you measure compassion. And instead, I started focusing on how do you measure consequential compassion. The fact that something actually changes. And I'm much more concerned about that, the change, than about where people start. The words of politicians and Wall Street bankers and medical workers, all of the people that made promises after Katrina and after the earthquake in Haiti and didn't follow through on them, they were people that you would see as having compassion, but not consequential compassion. They were willing to back off after the emergency was over. Bishop Tutu has said it's very hard to wake a man up who's pretending to be asleep. And for many people, after the fact, they're pretending to be asleep. They're pretending they don't remember what it was that they promised. Bishop Tutu also said that frequently people think compassion and love are merely sentimental. But he said, if you actually get involved, you find that they're very demanding. That consequential compassion is a demanding situation. Now, you probably won't get rich, but maybe some of you have figured that out already, that students in schools of public health aren't generally thinking about how will this skill make me rich. I know a few people who have become rich this way, but I like the story of Kierkegaard, who was the Danish philosopher who talked about someone breaking into a jewelry store and didn't steal a thing. All the person did was rearrange all the price tags. And we live in a world where the price tags have been rearranged, and we put the highest price on athletes and Wall Street bankers and the lowest price on nurses and public health workers and on people who are teachers, people that are doing the things every day that make our infrastructure work. And you are now going into a profession because you know the price tags ahead of time. And this is a wonderful thing. Do I have any regrets? Yes, I have one big regret. The single most important determinant of health in the world is poverty. The single most important. And what do we do about poverty? I can tell you, as I've told many people, that we benefit from poverty, so it's hard for us to really address it. But the comment about 47% of the population not paying federal income tax led to a lot of discussion about, oh, but these people do pay taxes, state taxes, and they pay sales tax, and they pay license tax, and so on. And I was asked to review a paper called Skin in the Game, asking, what is it that these people have invested in our country? And I said, there are two big areas not even discussed. Number one is that all of us benefit from them being poor because they provide us with clothes and food and services at a cheaper price, which means they're subsidizing us, because they're working at minimum wage. And the same thing for people working overseas. They're working at minimum wage, they're subsidizing us. And so we should be talking about a social equity tax paid by poor people. And the other thing that I've not heard much discussion on, when I read about deaths in Afghanistan, in our military troops, I say to myself, you know, a lot of these people are from the lower socioeconomic part of our population. They're not the ones that have made it into University of Washington. And so we have a disproportionate group of people from the lower socioeconomic groups that are protecting us and giving their lives to protect us. And who is talking about that in the 47%? So we should be talking about a patriotic tax paid by poor people. So use your public health skills, your medical skills, your scientific skills to figure out what we could be doing about poverty. It seems like such a simple step to say we not only need a minimum wage, we need a living wage, and we need a living wage that's indexed so that we don't have to go back to it every year, as just one step that we could be taking. Okay, fortune teller, ventriloquist, propagandist, master of deviation, magician, rewriter of history, immortality. It sounds like a pretty exciting vocation. And thanks for being part of it. Burning question, yes.
We could probably take 1 to 2 questions max.
What does it take for a person to make the change to, like, for example, the kind of change you made? What attributes does this person have to become someone who really make an impact?
You know, I don't, the question is, how could we all become better than we are? And I don't actually know the answer to that, but I do know that it makes a difference if we see that we're all in this together, and that I was struck many years ago by reading Albert Schweitzer's book, Out of My Life and Thought. He was fairly young when it suddenly occurred to him what kind of blessings he has had, and that he had an obligation, an absolute obligation to pay back. And so he decided that he would, quotes, play until he was 30. And by that I mean he got 3 earned doctoral degrees. But he did the things he wanted to do. And at age 30, he went into medical school and then spent the rest of his life in Africa, paying back. He was at the cutting edge of so many things, including ecology. He understood ecology long before other people did. And so it's this idea of being part of the group, that not separate. My wife and I went out to dinner last night, and we both took a book to read. And after a few minutes, she said, "You're not reading." And I said, "No, I'm thinking." She said, "What are you thinking about?" I said, "When you think about what happened to Rome, when the Goths invaded Rome in 210, And then you read that actually Rome had been deteriorating from within for at least 50 years, maybe 100 years, maybe more than that, because rich people wanted to become richer. And they did not want to actually invest in society. They weren't thinking in terms of what's good for all of us. And I said, I worry about that same thing happening in this country, that again, the divide between the rich and the poor becoming bigger and bigger, greater and greater. And I can tell you that the more education you get and the more money you make, the harder it becomes to actually talk to poor people. And so I tell people going into medicine that when you see poor people as patients, this may be their only contact in a year with someone from the middle class. And if there's to be a connection, it'll be only because you make that connection. They won't know how to make it. And so we become insulated the higher up we become with wealth or education, and we have a hard time thinking in terms of what's good for the entire society. My grandson at age 7 asked me, what's the most important thing people could do to make the world better? And it took me back. I mean, I wasn't expecting that kind of a question from him. And I said to him, you know, that question makes my world better right now. But I said to him, I think it's, if you truly are thinking several generations ahead with every decision you make, that you aren't making decisions for today or for this week, but you're actually thinking, what difference does this make in 500 years if we do this or if we do that? And we have trouble doing that. Jack.
Listening to you, it occurs to me that the public health paradigm, we talk about it, is actually quite a bit larger than how we conventionally think about public health. And I wonder if that makes any sense to you.
Absolutely. I mean, it's everything. There's nothing. In my class, in my public health class, there was a man from Nigeria by the name of Yemi Ademola. He was head of preventive medicine for Nigeria, and he was murdered during the war. But as class president, he wrote, there is no area of knowledge external to the needs of the public health person. And isn't that, I mean, that really states the case. And I often use that quote from him partly to give him immortality, because he was such a fine person. And partly because it's absolutely true. There is no area that we're not interested in, because everything comes back finally to what does this mean to people writ large, people as a group. And public health is personal health multiplied by every person in that group.